Hello, and welcome to Ask a Historian, brought to you by Heritage Mississauga. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, your host and historian with Heritage Mississauga. Together, we'll dive into the fascinating stories that shape our city. Remember, you can like, subscribe, and follow us. And don't forget to send your questions to history@heritagemississauga.org and help us explore more local history. And stay connected with Heritage Mississauga for more information on upcoming programs and events. On today's episode of Ask a Historian, we will share in the exploration of some local history inquiries that we have received recently relating to historic Erindale Village. Our first question this week comes from Robert. Robert noticed a plaque adjacent to the old Erindale Community Hall, and the question is, there's a plaque in front of the Erindale Community Hall that talks about Thomas Racey, and he's heard me, or I've heard you talk about the Racey tract of land before. But who was Thomas Racey? Well, Robert, thank you for the inquiry. I will admit Thomas Racey was always a little bit of a mystery. At least it was up until several years ago. And it took us a while to find him, actually, find information about him and where his life took him. Who indeed was Thomas Racey and what do we know of him? I'd almost given up hope a few years ago. And as I'm wont to do from time to time, I wander around historic cemeteries and no reason in particular sometimes, just to I enjoy the ambiance of the history that's found within hallowed grounds. And I was in a cemetery up in Hornby, not too far away from Mississauga, just wandering around one time a few years back now. And all of a sudden, there he was, a gravestone with Racey on it. But how did one of Mississauga's founders, if you will, end up buried in Hornby, outside of Milton in Halton County? I was a little bit surprised to find him there, and also just elated that we finally found where Thomas Racey was laid to rest. So, I'll give you a little bit about background. First of all, the plaque does reference the Racey tract and of a land speculator, if you will. He wasn't quite a land speculator, but we'll delve into that. The portion of Mississauga where Erindale Village lies was historically referred to as the Racey tract. This term applies to an area that consisted of two lots or ranges on both the north and south side of Dundas Street. If you're to trace or try to trace the Racey tract today, you can do it quite easily, actually, on our city's map. Three of the borders of the Racey tract are readily identifiable today. On the south side of the Racey tract, it's identified or bordered by the Queensway alignment. That is Queensway West, Blythe Road, and Lincoln Greenway. And on the west side by Fifth Line West. And on the north side by Harcus Road, which is the north entrance of the UTM campus. It's only the eastern border that's somewhat more difficult, is a little bit more difficult to identify, as it was angular and it's not defined by a specific road today. But it is roughly located between Erindale Station Road and Wolfdale Road on the modern landscape. In the heart of the Racey tract, which was again completed between 1820 and 1821, a village site was laid out in advance of expected settlers. The village was first called Toronto. And that's not the city of Toronto. We took the name first, after the surrounding township, but later it adopted the unofficial name of Credit when the first post office opened. A few names later, Credit became Springfield, which then became Springfield on the Credit, which then became Erindale and is now part of the city of Mississauga. But back to the focus of the inquiry, and that is on Thomas Racey. Thomas Racey was a government land agent who was responsible for overseeing the settlement of the village, that is the village of Erindale, and the development of mill sites along the Credit River within the allocated tract of land. Whether by design or not, Thomas's story has proven a little bit elusive for us. So Thomas Racey himself, he was born in Batheaston, Somersetshire in England in 1792, the seventh child of James and Jane Racey. Thomas, together with at least some of his family, came to Canada in 1805 at the age of 13. He is said to have received a plain English education. He found employment as a clerk working for Thomas Dixon near Queenston in the Niagara area, where he remained for 3 years before relocating to Ancaster, where he served as a clerk for Samuel Hatch. Thomas actively took part in the War of 1812, being posted at the garrison at Mount Pleasant near Brantford as a lieutenant with the 5th Lincoln Militia. Later in the conflict, Thomas is said to have made the personal acquaintance of General Isaac Brock. Thomas was placed on detached service in the expeditions against American General Hull's forces. In time, during the war, he rose to the rank of captain, and by 1814, Captain Thomas Racey was present at several battles. He served at Beaver Dams, Chippewa, and at Lundy's Lane, and he may have been present earlier in the war at the capture of Fort Detroit. Following his service with militia, Captain Racey settled in Niagara and became engaged in the mercantile business with import and exports and in the lumber trade. He proved to be a most capable businessman and came to own several Great Lakes sailing vessels that sailed the waters between Toronto, Hamilton, Niagara, and Buffalo to support his growing business endeavors. Of note, several of Thomas's siblings married into prominent political families. His sister, Anne Vizier Racey, married William Munson Jarvis of the prominent Jarvis family of Toronto, while his brother John married Sarah Robinson, daughter of Loyalist Christopher Robinson and sister to then acting Attorney General John Beverly Robinson, both families firmly entrenched within the family compact. Such family connections may have played a role in Captain Racey's rise to prominence. In 1820, Thomas was appointed as a government land agent. In that capacity, Thomas was expected to help establish settlement. In 1821, part of Toronto Township, that is historic Mississauga, was placed under his direction. He was expected to establish mills, lay out a village plot, and ensure that a stable foundation for population growth was laid. Thomas directed the creation of a grist mill, sawmill, and a village survey for what would become Erindale Village. But Thomas didn't remain in the area for very long, just over a year actually, when he re-entered private business and relocated to Quebec for 2 years. In 1825, his brother-in-law, Sir John Beverly Robinson, persuaded Thomas to accept a government position as an emigrant agent, and he was stationed in Hamilton. In 1833, Thomas became the new land registrar for Wentworth and Halton counties. In 1835, Thomas married Helen Priscilla Nels of Grimsby, the daughter of the Honorable Aram Nels, and afterwards they made permanent residence for his family in the town of Dundas. In 1853, Thomas was appointed the land registrar of Halton County, and he relocated his family to Milton. He served as the Halton County registrar for 48 years. Thomas and Helen had 5 children: Charles Sumpson, George Davis, Francis Walcote, Catherine Jane, and Helen Matilda. One mention of Thomas Racey states, Mr. Racey had the reputation of having lived an unblemished life. Of note, Thomas was featured in the Canadian Biographical Dictionary and Portrait Gallery of Eminent Self-Made Men, Ontario Volume, 1880. Thomas died in 1881, while still in office as a registrar of Halton, and is buried in the Ruhr County Graveyard at St. Stephen's Anglican Church in Hornby, near Milton. So there you go, Robert. That's a look at the mysterious Thomas Racey, his name is affixed to the Racey Tract and to the founding of Erindale Village, although he really only was here for a very short period of time, and his career took him further afield and in many different pursuits, ending his professional life as the registrar of Halton County for 48 years before passing away in 1881. Our second question this week is from Judy, and she is asking who the streets in Erindale Village are named for. Well, Erindale Village predates the city of Mississauga. You probably know that city of Mississauga was born through amalgamation of several places that were once independent of each other, Erindale Village being one of those. And as such, Erindale has a unique history of its own, including how its own streets were named. If you drive around small town Ontario, you'll invariably notice similarities in some street names. Almost every hamlet or village has some variation of the following street names: Main, Queen, King, Center, or Mill, or even Church Street. Names that are usually self-explanatory. Even our sister villages within Mississauga follow a little of this pattern. But Erindale is a little bit different. Have you ever wondered why that is? Why there's not a main street or a church street? So we'll jump into that though. Erindale does have a main street running through the center of the village. It's Dundas Street. Dundas was surveyed as a military road in 1796 under the order of Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, Sir John Graves Simcoe. The road connected 2 important commercial centers in Upper Canada, York and Dundas, which Hamilton today, and then inland to London, Ontario. and had to be sufficient distance from the shoreline of Lake Ontario to offer protection. The road was named Dundas simply because it led from the provincial capital of York, now Toronto, to the town of Dundas. The town was named after British Home Secretary Henry Dundas. The road took the path of least resistance through Erindale and wound its way down into the valley of the Credit River, taking a sharp S-turn at the eastern edge of the village and navigating the easiest slope through the steep valley. The original S-turn of Dundas Street is still evident today with the north and south sections of Dundas Crescent. The main intersection of Erindale was much the same as it is today, Dundas and Mississauga Road, then known as the Streetsville Road or the Cedar Swamp Road or the Springbank Road, depending on the era. The Cedar Swamp Road traced an indigenous trail that followed the Credit River past the Credit Mission site, now the Mississauga Golf and Country Club, to the harbor that would become Port Credit. Other Erindale street names include Jarvis Street, named for Frederick Starr Jarvis, a significant landowner, veteran of the War of 1812, constable, and a very staunch Tory supporter in politics. Jarvis didn't reside in Erindale Village. He lived in the Clarkson area of historic Mississauga, but was heavily involved in St. Peter's Anglican Church. His daughter Amelia married Alexander Proudfoot, a local mill owner, United Empire Loyalist, and well-to-do merchant. The Proudfoot family had extensive holdings and business interests here and in Trafalgar Township nearby. That's the name origin of Proudfoot Street in Erindale Village. Robinson Street in Erindale is named in honor of who was then the Attorney General of Upper Canada, Sir John Beverley Robinson. His small summer cottage still stands just west of the village, known as the Grange, and today home to Heritage Mississauga. The building likely acted briefly as a government office between York and Dundas. Thompson Street in Erindale was named for Colonel William Thompson, a Clarkson resident, UEL, and veteran of the War of 1812, and also a local early political leader. He was heavily involved in the early years of St. Peter's Anglican Church. Adamson Street in Erindale derives its name from the prominent Adamson family, namely two brothers, the Honorable General Peter Adamson and Dr. Joseph Adamson, who were amongst the earliest and most influential settlers in the area, although neither of them lived in the village proper. Two other village roads, Mindamoya and Nanticoke, received their modern names only in the 1950s. They probably represent the oldest two streets in the village, originally leading to mills and to a farm. These roads were simply called the first and second 40-foot roads. They were 40 feet wide so wagons could pass each other. Two local residents, Betty Boyd and Rose Scotchmer, tired of those original names, looked on a map of the province and picked out two indigenous names that they liked. Mindamoya was from Manitoulin Island, and Nanticoke from the shores of Lake Erie. Mindamoya translates as my old woman or place of the old woman, and Nanticoke means people of the water. If we extend our vision of Erindale a little bit further, we can find Hammond Road, named in reference to Oliver and Thomas Hammond, important members of St. Peter's Congregation of the Erindale community. The historically designated Hammond House still stands, one of the hidden gems of modern Mississauga. You can also find, for a little further afield, Erindale Station Road, the road that led to Erindale's first train station. Another is Old Carriage Road, which connected to Stavebank, so named because of a stave-making company located along the course of the road. And these led down into Port Credit. The street names of Erindale give an interesting insight to the life and times of early Upper Canada, and were mostly named for somewhat wealthy members of the nearby Anglican Church. They reflect Erindale's early importance as a vital crossroads and the government seat between York and Dundas. The village was christened Erindale, which means Ireland in the Valley, on August 2nd, 1900, after the nearby estate of Reverend James McGraw, the first Reverend of St. Peter's. Our third and final story this week comes from Iris, and she is asking about the story behind the Great Erindale Fire. Fire is something that affected many historic communities here in Mississauga and beyond. It was an ever-present threat, and Erindale was not spared the burning flames either. Disaster struck in Erindale with the discarding of a match. The date was Monday, May 5th, 1919, at about 2:30 in the afternoon. It was a warm day, and there was a strong wind blowing out of the northwest. According to newspaper reports and tradition, a customer, possibly by the name of John Wilson, walked into J.M. Barker's general store in Arundel and purchased a cigar and matches. A match was lit, the cigar was lighted, and the match discarded in the garbage bin. At least that was the intent. The bucket, the garbage bin itself, however, held coal oil, and it was not a garbage bin, and the match was still burning. J.M. Barker's general store on Dundas Street was a grocery store, hardware store, and post office. In addition to serving as a village postmaster, John Barker was also a notary, justice of the peace, and insurer of marriage licenses. He was also the local coal oil and kerosene retailer. A bucket of coal oil immediately ignited, and the fire quickly spread to the wooden floorboards. Sparks rained down through the floorboards into the basement of the store where barrels of coal oil and kerosene were kept. The alarm calls went out to Brampton, Cooksville, Port Credit, Streetsville, and Toronto, and Arundel residents quickly formed a bucket brigade in a valiant but futile effort to extinguish the blaze. Immediate attempts were made to quell the fire, but within minutes it was clear that the old Erindale General Store was lost, and the fire was quickly spreading in the wind, consuming the store, its stock of goods, the post office, and the adjoining Barker family home within minutes. The fire then spread east, and despite efforts of the Bucket Brigade, the 99-year-old landmark, the Royal Exchange Hotel next door, caught fire. Proprietors Thomas Barker and George Meridew and his wife were able to get out in time, and some of the furnishings were removed, but they could do little to save the old wooden building in the hot, dry, windy afternoon. Soon the adjacent livery stables were also lost, as were reportedly 2 horses and 2 wagons. Within 25 minutes of the alarm being raised, volunteer firefighters from Port Credit, Streetsville, and Brampton had arrived to lend assistance. Toronto apparently refused to send the aid to the call. They succeeded in stopping the fire from spreading further east and saved Ward's Mill. Ward's Mill, later owned by the Brown family, burned itself in 1923. Fanned by increasing winds, the roaring fire leapt across Dundas Street, igniting the old town hall. Built around 1839 by the McGraw family, the building had served as both a hotel and a store before being donated to St. Peter's Anglican Church for use as a parish hall. In the early 1890s, the old building had been remodeled into the town hall, and a bell tower had been added. The beloved building burned, and witnesses recalled the bell tolling sadly in the wind and the flames for several minutes before crashing loose. Nearby, Burke's implement shop also caught fire several times, but firefighting efforts eventually extinguished the fires and saved the buildings, one of the few survivors of the Great Erindale Fire. 4 hours after the blaze began, the fire was finally out, but Erindale would never be the same. The historic commercial core along Dundas Street was gone, including Barker's General Store, post office and house, the famed Royal Exchange Hotel, including its stables, the town hall, and 2 outbuildings, and Taylor Statton's barn. The Barker General Store was replaced. Its replacement still stands today, known as O'Neill's Vacuum Center on Dundas Street, which is in the old General Store building that was built in 1921. The town hall was replaced several years later in 1928 by the surviving Erindale Community Hall, which was built on the same site. The Royal Exchange Hotel, however, was gone, and it was never replaced. Thankfully, there was no loss of life, but the face and fortune of Erindale Village was forever changed in the early afternoon of May 5th of 1919. Well, thank you for spending some time with us here on Ask a Historian. Like, subscribe, and follow us, and stay up to date on programs and events with Heritage Mississauga. And please join us next time on Ask a Historian for more fascinating stories from Mississauga's history.